Hey everyone, it's Kale from Scud Style, and today I want to bring my first poker video to the channel. This first video is going to be about live poker, and actually the top 3 live poker tells that I found to be most effective / reliable, I guess just most altogether useful in my experience and based on the literature and where all the literature and other people's experience has met my own. Playing poker for the past 6 years, at a pretty high level. So, the first, we'll start with number 3, the third most powerful tell, and that, in my experience, has kind of been when there's a player who maybe has been betting in a live game. And I've noticed this a lot with kind of older players, especially if you're a younger player who has kind of an image of being tough and this and that, and they don't want you to bet. They will kind of stack out their chips before it's their turn to act like they're going to bet, whether they're in position or out of position, doesn't really matter. Hold them in their hand like they're ready to bet, and then they'll check. And that's almost always, in my experience, a very powerful sign that they're not very strong. They're not check raising you with that move. They're not doing anything like that. It's almost always like they want to see another card, or they want to get to a cheap showdown, or they want to this or that, and they do not want to see a bet from you. So they're kind of posturing with their chips there to prevent you from betting in the first place. So I've noticed that as a very strong tell for pretty much capping their range and being pretty certain that they don't have a monster there, and that if you have the strength and the bravery and the power to pull the trigger there for a big bet or an overbet or something like that, they're almost never going to call you unless they have history with you. The second most powerful tell that I think is pretty timeless, as long as the player isn't a very good player and isn't already aware of this. This works very well for people who don't necessarily know any better, but it's pretty rock solid when it does come up, is players will double check their hole cards on a monochrome board, or a board of all the same suit. So whether that's on the flop when 3 clubs flop, or on the turn when a 4th club peels off and they check their hole cards. On the flop situation, they almost never have a flush when they're double checking their hole cards, especially if it's not normal behavior for them. And this will depend on their experience level. But once you kind of get a feel for this tell, most people are much better able to remember their hand when it's suited than they are when it's offsuit and remembering the particular suits. So if they have 6-5 of clubs and the flop comes ace, king, 4 of clubs, they're almost never going to recheck their recheck their cards, their hole cards to see if they have 2 clubs or a club, because almost always going to remember that they have the 6-5 of clubs specifically, which is different than if they had a 6 of clubs, 5 of spades, or 1 red, 1 black, 6 of hearts, 5 of spades, and might have to check back to see if they have one of those being a club. So that's a very powerful tell to kind of be able to, again, cap their range, and it's a very powerful tool, and it's a very useful tell if you can know, hey, my opponent didn't flop a flush here, or hey, he might have, because normally he would check his hole cards in this kind of situation, and this time he doesn't. Or, again, tells are really good using against a baseline. So if he's the kind of player who never remembers his cards, or never remembers his hands, and is usually checking every flop, after the flop, checking his hand again, and then this particular time on a monochrome flop, he doesn't check his hand, that's kind of an alarm bell there. And then the number 1 tell that I think is most altogether useful and pretty across the board, across good players and not so good players. Obviously, it's going to be more prevalent against players who aren't aware of this type of tell or aren't as good of a player, and are maybe newer to the game, but is how quickly they look away from the flop when they see it. How long they stare at the board versus how short they stare at the board, or how if they just quickly glance at it and look away. So, and I'll do a few little caveats and things like that with this one as well. So typically, the basic rule of thumb is that the quicker they look away from the flop, the more likely they are to have smashed it. So things like when people flop sets, they don't sit there staring at the board unless they're aware of this and they're leveling you or something. If it's a genuine reaction, people's genuine reaction is to not stare at the board because they don't want to look like they're interested in it and they don't want to look like there's anything there for it. So if it looks like a very unassuming board and they look away really quickly and then they're playing the hand kind of funky or they're showing a lot of strength, you can be pretty sure that sets are more common than normal there. Things like that. Same with flop straights, or it can work with top pair or anything like that. But normally it's with a particularly strong hand. If they just flop a pair, it's not going to be like, oh man, I hit this board really hard, I'm going to look away real fast. It's more for stronger hands. It could be the same with flushes and things like that. So pairing it with the last tell, if the guy looks away real quickly and doesn't check his whole cards, he's much more likely than had you not had any tell information at all to have flopped a flush on that hand, as uncommon as that is. And the other thing to look for with this is, as a result of this tell, I think all good players should make it a practice to be watching their opponents when the cards come out, when the flop comes out, when the turn comes out, when the river comes out. However, I've also noticed that, especially if you kind of have a tougher image or this and that, or you play aggressively, or everyone doesn't really like playing with you necessarily, this or that, which can happen if you're a winning player, and things like that. It's just competitiveness. I recommend strongly not just unabashedly, without sunglasses on or anything like that, just staring at your opponent as the flop comes out. They will notice that, and 4 out of 5 times, or 4 out of 5 opponents, roughly throwing that out there, are going to just stare right back at you. And as soon as they know your eyes are just focused on them, you're losing any opportunity you have of getting a genuine reaction from them. If you're kind of, you're looking at the board and then you kind of glance up right before the cards come out, that's much different and it's much less invasive and intimidating and just instigative than just, all right, the board's coming out, he's first to act, I'm just going to stare at him and I don't have to look at the board until it's my turn and blah, blah, blah. I find that players do that, and on my end, I stare right back at them too, and then I'm steeled and ready to glance down at the board in a very neutral, robotic way. I don't want to give them the opportunity to do that. I don't want to give them the awareness that I am dialed in and I am looking for any kind of reaction. I mostly you want to come across as you're not focused and dialed in. You'll get more genuine reactions that way. And so for things like wearing sunglasses helps with this because they might not even be able to tell if you're looking at them. Hats, wearing low. I'm not in favor of these things in poker in general, but because they exist and they are an edge, I think you should use them if you care about that kind of things. Anyway, especially in an environment where, and I can make another video on this in the future, especially in an environment where maybe you don't play with these players all the time, you don't want to, or you already have been pegged as a good player or this and that, or maybe you don't like to talk a lot and this and that, because those kinds of things make people less friendly towards you. They don't want to interact with you and this and that. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's nice. And sometimes it makes them want to play against you harder. So for another time, but those are my top 3 live poker tells that in my experience and that amassed with other data I've come from other poker tells books and talking with other great players and this and that. But those are ones that I see a lot, and they are pretty solid. And if you couple them with history and their betting patterns and their baselines for all these tells and their behavior at the poker table, they can become very powerful tools with very little effort added. So pay attention and don't be a jerk about it, and you'll do great. Okay, this is Kale from Scott Style. Have a great day.